When most people think of Godzilla, a particular image comes to mind: a fire-breathing dinosaur the size of a skyscraper wreaking havoc across Japanese cities. To some members of the North American audience, such a description is the be-all and end-all as it pertains to the character. Yet most would be intrigued to know that the very name of Godzilla has found itself attached to a whopping 38 films, countless video games, a library of novelizations, and comic books as well as parodies. However, when one thoroughly examines the character of Godzilla, the almost indestructible behemoth finds itself embedded in the ever-intriguing world of allegory and metaphor. As casual onlookers and observers of Godzilla may be surprised to learn, the original film that introduced the character, Godzilla, or Gojira, from 1954, is one of the most hyper-realistic, gritty, and depressingly frightening films ever to grace the silver screen, and might just be the darkest monster movie ever made as a result. Disregarding any semblance of cheesiness, the film employs Godzilla as a destructive force that, given the time period in Japan in which it was produced, terrorizes the people of Japan with the destructive might of a dozen atomic bombs as opposed to one. Further, in 2016, a quasi-remake entitled Shin Godzilla was released that featured a similar premise, except as opposed to nuclear weapons, the film concerned the matter of nuclear disaster and devastation from nuclear plant meltdowns and other sources of nuclear catastrophe, in line with more contemporary threats faced by the Japanese. More recently, Godzilla Minus One also explored similar themes to the 1954 original, in that it is set in Japan directly following the devastation of the Second World War, featuring characters that confront the daikaiju menace whilst coming to terms with their own purposes and dark pasts. With global tensions skyrocketing and beginning to mirror the height of the Cold War, the allegories and metaphors of the original Godzilla film and a number of its sequels continue to dwell in a world of relevance, as the driving thematic forces behind the films paint Godzilla as a tall and destructive metaphor for nuclear devastation. Whether caused by atomic bombs that can kill millions if not billions, or nuclear disasters reminiscent of power plant catastrophes, such films concern social and global themes that continue to frighten us by their relevance, made by a country that had experienced such horrors firsthand in the form of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the 2011 Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster. In order to concretely gauge and examine the original 1954 Godzilla film, a peek into the troubled state of post-World War II Japan is necessary. After the dismantling of Imperial Japan at the hands of the Allied forces including the United States and the Soviet Union, and especially after the dropping of the Fat Man and Little Boy atomic bombs, which quickly resulted in a Japanese surrender to the Allies, Japan found itself in a gravely diminished state. From the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, to the Japanese surrender on the 2nd of September 1945, a staggering 2.5 million Japanese people had lost their lives, including over 500,000 civilians throughout the war. In addition, the cities of Tokyo, Kyoto, and other regions were completely reduced to ashy ruins as a result of relentless Allied bombings that managed to dwarf even the sizable impacts of the atomic bombs by a wide margin, known as fire bombings. Due to such horrors, the wealth of Japan had decreased by a whopping 1/3 throughout the duration of the war. Amid such a bleak aftermath and a gargantuan effort to recover, a Japanese film production studio named Toho Studios emerged from the ashes. Initially founded in 1932, just a year after Japan's first military invasion into Korea and China, a post-war Toho Studios would employ notable directors, composers, and special effects artists in their ranks, with key figures including director Ishiro Honda, special effects master Eiji Tsuburaya, and film composer Akira Ifukube. Notably, Honda, Tsuburaya, and Ifukube would grit their collective teeth during the period of military conflict during World War II. While Honda would serve as assistant director on propaganda films that exhibited Japan's quote-unquote heroic image during the war, Tsuburaya would assist with his elaborate special effects, creating minuscule 1x25 scale models of battleships and fighter planes for Japanese war movies, miniature prop building that would serve him well in his future projects of monstrous proportions. Furthermore, Akira Ifukube, a renowned composer in Japan, would be commissioned to compose patriotic military marches for the Japanese government during wartime, as a means to shore up support for the war and boost the morale of Japanese troops fighting across the Pacific and Asia. After the war, however, Toho Studios allowed such masters of their crafts to cross paths. With their shared frustrations and sadness stemming from Japan's poor post-war state, and with swaths of experience accumulated during the war, the trio would come together to create a masterpiece of cinema that reflected their inner melancholy and paranoid uncertainty for the future. Godzilla, 1954. The film begins with a quaint and unexpected first scene for what appears to be a monster movie. The crew of a Japanese fishing ship playing harmonicas and soaking in the sun when they would otherwise be going for a swim. Suddenly, a blinding flash of white light overtakes the ship, prompting the crewmen to run as the ship catches fire and proceeds to sink. Without any provided context or exposition, the film cuts to scenes of frantic crowds of family members demanding answers as to the whereabouts of their family members who were on board the struck ship. Notably, this instance in the film is modeled purely after the unfortunate Lucky Dragon No. 5 incident in Japan's history, in which a small Japanese fishing vessel was caught in the crosshairs of an American nuclear bomb test just months before the film's release, contaminating a crew of 23 fishermen with radiation. One could argue, too, that the sudden flash of white light before the crewmen of the ship is representative of the instantaneous nature of a nuclear blast and nuclear war. How, often without warning and almost immediately, a nuclear strike both surprises and eradicates all that lies in its wake. As the film progresses, the primary human protagonists of the film, including Dr. Yamane, a paleontologist hell-bent on learning more about Godzilla, portrayed by the legendary Takashi Shimura, investigate the increasing number of mysterious ship explosions off of Japan's coast. His daughter, Emiko, assists her father, yet fails to understand why her father would be so adamant about being so interested in the continued study of Godzilla, instead of destroying it as championed by the Japanese people, who are growing increasingly more anxious. Meanwhile, Dr. Serizawa, Emiko's lover of the past, is a scientist who has been secretly developing a powerful weapon of mass destruction known as the Oxygen Destroyer, a weapon that, once placed in a large body of water, such as a sea or a lake, decimates all life in the said body of water by draining all oxygen. After Godzilla ultimately destroys the city of Tokyo towards the film's climax, Emiko returns to Dr. Serizawa and pleads for him to unleash his weapon to kill Godzilla, much to the chagrin of Ogata, Emiko's current lover. Finally submitting after seeing raw images and footage of a devastated Tokyo as a result of Godzilla's unapologetic onslaught, Serizawa agrees to deploy the Oxygen Destroyer, and the weapon is used to defeat Godzilla as it slumbers at the bottom of the ocean. Strikingly, with such a heart-rending plot and complex storyline, many similarities can be made between the horror as exhibited in the film by Godzilla's rampage on Japan, and the crushing state of post-war Japan and its reverberating fears that continue to linger in the fabric of Japanese society today. In essence, the film stands as a protest against the usage and a stern critique of the very existence of nuclear weapons, as demonstrated simply by Godzilla's rampage and its subsequent effects. Possibly the most shocking and emotionally impactful shots of the film immediately follow the film's climax of Godzilla's destruction of Tokyo, in which nurses are seen carrying stretchers holding dead bodies, doctors are seen utilizing radiation detection devices on affected children, and a little girl cries over the corpse of her dead mother. While such a scene paints a stark contrast to the colorful and more lighthearted Godzilla films of the 60s and 70s, it also demonstrates the allegorical nature of the film. Godzilla is the atomic bomb, and by extension is also symbolic of the capabilities of man's evil towards man. While, yes, Godzilla is an overgrown dinosaur monster that breathes fire, it is also a metaphor for the dangers and risks posed by nuclear weapons. A danger that the Japanese cast, crew, and audience were fully aware of by the time of the film's release on November 3, 1954. Even more so than pretty much everyone else, which, luckily, continues to be the case today. In this regard, the grim images of corpses littering a medical care facility are indistinguishable from the photographs and written accounts documenting the devastation following the atomic bombings on Japan that brought an end to the Second World War. With the film's gritty and haunting black and white photography and cinematography, and imposing worm's-eye view shots of Godzilla creepily walking to and fro city blocks, breathing fire on crowds of runaway pedestrians and military tanks, it is as though the audience is seeing a slow-paced onslaught of US military planes wreaking havoc on Japanese cities filled with innocent civilians. To this end, Toho created a wrathful cry of protest against the United States and the rest of the world through Godzilla, begging for nuclear weapons production and tests to cease entirely so that countries around the world would never have to endure the suffocating plight of nuclear ruination as Japan did. Moreover, with its cunning metaphor and allegory of painting Godzilla as a symbol of the same nuclear devastation that had killed tens of thousands of Japanese civilians and groundbreaking special effects, Godzilla 1954 proved to be a monolithic box office and critical success in Japan upon its release. As a result, as of 2024, a staggering 38 Godzilla films have been released from 1954 to 2024, with the most recent being Godzilla and Kong: The New Empire, a cathartic and fun entry that proves that Godzilla can be utilized in a variety of different ways, whether a destructive symbol of nuclear or natural devastation or practically a superhero. Ultimately, contrary to the perceptions and images possessed by casual onlookers and audiences largely unfamiliar with the character, Godzilla stands as a titan of metaphor and allegory. Whether the walking and imposing allegory for nuclear weapon use, as well as the general threats posed by such weapons as seen in the 1954 original film, or a metaphorical device crafted to embody Japan's threats all throughout history, Godzilla represents far more than measly destruction. By emphasizing the negative and destructive impact on humans in the original film, the filmmakers converted the plot that would otherwise be a typical B-grade monster movie, which are still great by the way, into a statement enveloped in the tragic and politically pertinent. In a modern world in which international relations have sunk to dangerous lows that allow for conditions to be made more conducive for the possibility of a renewed push to warrant the usage of nuclear weapons, as well as the silent dangers raised by nuclear facilities that could shut down at any given moment, the thematic and allegorical significance of the original Godzilla from 1954 and some of the films that followed it is impossible to overstate. Long live the King of the Monsters.